September 23rd, 2010, 8:47 p.m. Teresa Lewis sits in a cold cell at Greensville Correctional Center, 13 feet from a room where she will die. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. She can hear the muffled voices of the execution team preparing the gurney, testing the IV lines that will carry poison into her veins. In exactly 73 minutes, she will become the first woman executed in Virginia in 98 years. Her last meal, fried chicken, peas with butter, a slice of German chocolate cake, sits heavy in her stomach. She's wearing prison-issued clothing, and her hands won't stop trembling. Outside, protesters hold candles. Inside, the family of 2 murder men waits for justice. But here's what haunts this case. Teresa Lewis never pulled a trigger. The men who did, they're still alive. So how does a woman with an IQ of 72 end up on death row while the actual killers get to live? Let me take you back 8 years earlier. October 23rd, 2002. A different kind of waiting. Julian Lewis, 51 years old, lies in his bed, asleep. His son, CJ, 25, is in the next room. Both men have no idea that in minutes, 2 armed intruders will walk their front door, a door deliberately left unlocked. The gunshots shatter the night. Julian dies almost instantly, shot multiple times, including once in the head. CJ stumbles out his room, bleeding and desperate. He manages to dial 911, gasping for air, fighting to tell the dispatcher what's happening. But here's the part that will freeze your blood. Teresa Lewis, Julian's wife, didn't call for help. She waited. For 45 minutes, she stepped over their dying bodies. 45 minutes while her husband and stepson bled out on the floor, gasping their final breaths. She made sure they would die. And it was all for money. A life insurance payout of $300,000. Before we unravel this twisted story of manipulation, murder, and a controversial execution that divided a nation, I need you to do something. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? These stories take hours to research and bring to you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever heard of someone doing something this cold-blooded for money? Your engagement keeps this channel alive, because what happens next will shake you. Let's go back to where it all began. To understand how a woman ends up orchestrating the murder of her own husband, you need to understand who Teresa Wilson was long before she became Teresa Lewis, the killer. Born April 26, 1969, in Danville, Virginia, Teresa grew up in a working-class environment that offered more struggle than opportunity. She wasn't academically gifted. Her IQ was measured at 72, placing her in the borderline range of intellectual disability. School was a battlefield she couldn't win, so she dropped out early. What Teresa lacked in intelligence, she made up for in desperation. A desperate need to be loved. A desperate need to belong. A desperate need for anyone to make her feel worthy. She married young and had a daughter named Christy, but that marriage crumbled like everything else in her life. Low-wage jobs, failed relationships, a pattern of poor decisions that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Have you ever met someone who seemed to destroy everything good in their life? Someone who couldn't escape their own worst decisions? Teresa was that person. Then in 1996, something changed. Teresa met Julian Clifton Lewis Jr., a forklift operator at Dan River Mills. Julian wasn't flashy or exciting, but he offered something Teresa had never truly had: stability. Julian was a good man, the kind of man who showed up to work every day, paid his bills on time, and loved his family fiercely. He was described by everyone who knew him as kind, hardworking, and devoted. He had a son from a previous relationship, Charles. Everyone called him CJ, who lived with him. When Teresa and Julian married, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Teresa had found her safe harbor. Julian provided for the family. Teresa took care of the home. For a while, life was normal, but Teresa had patterns that stability couldn't erase. She craved attention from other men. She was manipulative, always searching for validation outside her marriage. Julian either didn't see it or chose to ignore it, hoping love would be enough. It wouldn't be. Julian had done what responsible men do. He'd purchased a life insurance policy worth $250,000. Teresa was the beneficiary. CJ also had a policy, $50,000. These policies were supposed to protect the family if tragedy struck. Instead, they became a motive for murder. Think about that for a moment. Julian worked hard, loved his wife, provided a home, and made sure his family would be taken care of if something happened to him. He trusted Teresa with everything, and she would use that trust to orchestrate his execution. But here's where the story gets complicated, where the line between victim and villain blurs in ways that made this case so controversial. Was Teresa Lewis a cold-blooded mastermind who manipulated two young men into committing murder? Or was she an intellectually disabled woman, so desperate for love and validation that she became the puppet of someone far more dangerous? The prosecution would argue the first. The defense would scream the second. And the truth lived somewhere in the messy, tragic middle. Because in summer 2002, Teresa Lewis walked into a Walmart and met a 22-year-old man named Matthew Shallenberger. He was young and charming and saw opportunity in Teresa's weakness the way a predator smells blood. What happened next wasn't just an affair. It was the beginning of a murder plot that would leave two innocent men dead and raise questions about justice that remain unanswered to this day. Summer 2002, a Walmart in Danville, Virginia. Teresa Lewis, 33 years old, married and unfulfilled, walks down an aisle and locks eyes with Matthew Shallenberger. He's 22, young, handsome, charming in that dangerous way that makes broken people feel seen. Matthew worked at the store, and what started as casual flirtation quickly became something else. Teresa was starving for attention, and Matthew was hungry for opportunity. The affair began fast. Secret phone calls, stolen moments. Teresa became obsessed, and I mean truly obsessed. Friends and family would later say she lived for Matthew's attention, that she seemed addicted to his approval like a drug she couldn't quit. But Matthew Shallenberger wasn't just some young guy having an affair with an older woman. He had a criminal mindset. He was calculating, manipulative. And when he learned about those life insurance policies, $250,000 on Julian, $50,000 on CJ, something clicked in his mind. Matthew saw dollar signs, and he saw Teresa as the key to getting them. Matthew didn't work alone. He brought in Rodney Fuller, a 19-year-old who happened to be Matthew's former lover. Yes, you heard that right. Matthew and Rodney had a complicated romantic history, but now they were about to become partners in something far darker. The three of them, Teresa, Matthew, and Rodney, formed a toxic triangle bound together by lust, greed, and manipulation. Matthew played Teresa like a violin. He knew exactly what buttons to push. He fed her fantasies of a future together, whispered promises of love and freedom, and made her believe that Julian was the only obstacle standing between them and happiness. What if he was just gone? It probably started as a hypothetical, a dark joke, but with someone like Matthew planting seeds in the mind of someone like Teresa, desperate, intellectually limited, emotionally dependent, those seeds grew into something monstrous. Can you imagine being so desperate for someone's love that you'd cross a line you can never come back from? Teresa crossed it. Matthew weaponized her need for validation. He made her believe that murder was the only path to the life she wanted. And because Teresa's entire sense of worth was wrapped up in Matthew's approval, she agreed. The planning began in earnest. Late-night conversations, whispered schemes, Matthew laid out the framework. Teresa would leave the door unlocked. She'd provide the guns. Matthew and Rodney would do the rest. Matthew was smart enough to keep his hands clean in the planning stages, letting Teresa take the active role, obtaining the weapons and facilitating access to the house. He was already building his defense, making sure that if things went south, Teresa would be holding the bag. And Teresa, she went along with every twisted detail, because Matthew told her to, because she believed that on the other side of this nightmare, they'd be together, that the insurance money would set them free, that love, or whatever twisted version of it she convinced herself this was, would finally be hers. Rodney Fuller, young and impressionable, followed Matthew's lead. The plan was set. The date was chosen. October 23rd, 2002. What Teresa didn't understand, what her limited intellect couldn't grasp, was that Matthew Shallenberger didn't love her. He never had. She wasn't his partner. She was his tool, his patsy, the person who would take the fall while he walked away. But none of them walked away, because when you invite evil into your home, it devours everything. October 23rd, 2002, the day evil walked through an unlocked door. That morning, Julian Lewis woke up, kissed his wife, and went to work at Dan River Mills. He operated a forklift, came home tired, and ate dinner with his family. It was a Wednesday. Ordinary. Unremarkable. CJ, his 25-year-old son, spent a day like any other young man, working, maybe talking to friends, thinking about his future. He had no idea he had less than 12 hours to live. Teresa went through the motions of being a wife, but her mind was elsewhere. Her phone buzzed with messages from Matthew. The plan was in motion. Tonight was the night. She obtained 2 9mm handguns, weapons meant for one purpose only. She handed them over to Matthew and Rodney, her hands probably trembling, her heart racing. Was there a moment where she could have stopped? Where she could have said, "No, this is insane. I can't do this." If there was, she didn't take it. That evening, Julian came home exhausted. He probably hugged Teresa, asked about her day, and settled into his routine. Around 11 o'clock, he went to bed. CJ was in his room, likely scrolling through his phone or watching TV. The house was quiet, peaceful. Teresa walked to the front door and made sure it was unlocked. A portal to death left wide open. 11:30 p.m. Matthew Shallenberger and Rodney Fuller approached the Lewis home in the darkness. No masks, no hesitation. They knew exactly where they were going and what they were about to do. They didn't have to break in. They didn't have to force entry. The door was unlocked, just as Teresa promised. They stepped inside. The house was dark, except for a few dim lights. They moved quietly through the hallway, their footsteps soft on the carpet. Matthew carried 1 9mm. Rodney carried the other. Julian Lewis was asleep in his bed, 51 years old, a man who had worked hard his entire life, a man who trusted his wife, a man who had no idea that 2 strangers were standing in his bedroom doorway, guns raised. The first shot shattered the silence. Then another, and another. Julian was shot multiple times, chest, torso, and head. He died in his own bed, in the home he provided, killed by men his wife had invited in. He never had a chance to fight back, never had a chance to ask why. The gunshots echoed through the house like thunder. CJ heard them. In the next room, his eyes flew open. Confusion, then terror. He stumbled out of his bedroom to see what was happening, and came face to face with his father's killers. They shot him immediately, multiple times. CJ collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from his wounds. But CJ didn't die instantly. CJ Lewis, bleeding and dying, did something remarkable, something that showed extraordinary courage in his final moments. He crawled to the phone. With trembling, blood-soaked hands, he dialed 911. The call was heartbreaking. You could hear him gasping for air, struggling to form words, fighting against the darkness closing in. He told the dispatcher that he and his father had been shot. His voice was weak, fading. Every breath was a battle. The dispatcher kept him on the line, begging him to stay awake, telling him help was coming. But CJ's words became slower, more labored. He was drowning in his own blood. Where was Teresa during all of this? She was in the house. She heard the gunshots. She saw the blood. She watched Matthew and Rodney flee into the night, their mission complete. And then she made a choice that would seal her fate and define her as something far worse than an accomplice. Teresa Lewis did not immediately call for help. She didn't rush to her husband's side. She didn't try to save CJ, who was still clinging to life, still fighting to survive. Instead, she waited. For 45 minutes, Teresa Lewis walked through that house while two men bled out on the floor. Evidence would later show she stepped over their bodies. She ensured that by the time paramedics arrived, both Julian and CJ would be beyond saving. She let them die. Think about that level of coldness. 45 minutes. That's not panic. That's not shock. That's calculated murder. When police finally arrived, they found both men dead. Julian in his bed, multiple gunshot wounds. CJ on the floor, his phone still clutched in his hand. The 911 call that couldn't save him. And there was Teresa, playing the role of devastated widow. Crying, screaming, acting shocked. But detectives saw through it immediately. Something was off. Her grief felt performative, rehearsed. And the evidence told a story she couldn't explain away. No forced entry, nothing stolen. And that 45-minute gap that made no sense unless you wanted them dead. Before we continue, I need to pause and ask you something. If this story is gripping you, if you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, hit that subscribe button. This channel survives because of viewers like you who care about real stories, real justice, and real consequences. Drop a comment and tell me, could you ever imagine waiting while someone you love died? Because this case is about to get even more twisted. The investigation was just beginning, and Teresa's lies were about to unravel. Experienced homicide detectives develop instincts. They can smell a lie the way you smell smoke before you see fire. And everything about Teresa Lewis's story reeked. She told investigators it must have been a robbery gone wrong, random intruders, terrible tragedy. But the detectives weren't buying it. First red flag, no forced entry. The door had been unlocked. Whoever killed Julian and CJ Lewis walked right in like they were expected. Second red flag, nothing was stolen. No ransacked drawers. No missing valuables. No signs of anyone searching for cash or jewelry. If this was a robbery, it was the worst robbery in criminal history. Third red flag, Teresa herself. Her tears seemed manufactured. Her shock felt scripted. She kept saying the right words, but they landed wrong. Like an actor who'd memorized lines but didn't understand the character. And then there was that 45-minute delay. Detectives couldn't wrap their heads around it. Why would a loving wife wait that long to call for help? Unless she wasn't trying to help at all. The investigation shifted immediately. This wasn't random violence. This was personal, premeditated, and Teresa Lewis was at the center of it. Detectives started digging into her life, her relationships, and her phone records. That's when everything exploded. Phone records don't lie. Detectives pulled Teresa's call logs and found a pattern that told the entire story. Dozens of calls to a number belonging to Matthew Shallenberger in the days and weeks leading up to murders. The frequency increased as October 23rd approached. Sometimes multiple calls per day, late at night, secretive. When investigators confronted Teresa about Matthew, her carefully constructed facade began crumbling. Yes, she admitted she'd been having an affair, but she swore she had nothing to do with the murders. Detectives brought Matthew Shallenberger in for questioning. Then Rodney Fuller. And that's when the betrayals began. Have you ever wondered what makes someone finally confess to murder? Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's fear. But most often, it's self-preservation. The moment criminals realize they're going down, they start pointing fingers, trying to save themselves. Rodney Fuller cracked first. He was 19 years old and terrified, and he broke under questioning like glass under a hammer. He laid out the entire plot. How Matthew had orchestrated everything, how Teresa provided the guns and left the door unlocked, and how they planned it for weeks. Then Matthew, realizing Rodney had already talked, gave his own statement. But Matthew's version painted Teresa as the mastermind, the puppet master pulling all the strings. The mountain of evidence grew insurmountable. Phone records, dozens of calls between Teresa and Matthew, intensifying before the murders. Life insurance policies, $250,000 on Julian, $50,000 on CJ. Teresa was a beneficiary of both. Witness testimony. Rodney and Matthew both placed Teresa at the center of conspiracy. The guns were traced back to Teresa's acquisition, and that damning 45-minute delay. Proof that Teresa wanted them dead, that she'd ensure they wouldn't survive to identify their attackers. Every piece fit together like a puzzle designed by death itself. Within days, Teresa Lewis was arrested and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The case that seemed like a random home invasion was actually a cold, calculated plot driven by greed and manipulation. But here's where the story splits into 2 competing narratives that would define the rest of this case. The prosecution saw Teresa as a master manipulator who seduced 2 young men into committing murder for insurance money. The defense saw her as an intellectually disabled woman, IQ of 72, manipulated by the smarter, more cunning Matthew Shallenberger. Who was the puppet? Who was the puppet master? The trial would have to decide, and that decision would determine whether Teresa Lewis lived or died. May 2003. Teresa Lewis stood before a judge and did something unexpected. She pleaded guilty. No trial, no jury deliberation on guilt or innocence. She admitted to 2 counts of capital murder, orchestrating the deaths of Julian and CJ Lewis. But here's what most people don't know. Teresa didn't plead guilty because she wanted to. She did it to save her daughter. Prosecutors had initially suspected that Christy, Teresa's daughter, might have had knowledge of the murder plot. There was no solid evidence, but the threat hung in the air like a knife. The plea deal offered Teresa a grim bargain. Plead guilty, and we won't pursue charges against Christy. What would you do if you were facing death row, but pleading guilty meant your child would be safe? Teresa took the deal, but pleading guilty didn't mean the case was over. In Virginia, even with a guilty plea in a capital murder case, a jury must still decide the sentence during a separate hearing. Life in prison or death by lethal injection. The sentencing phase became a battle over a single question. Who was Teresa Lewis, really? Was she the cold-blooded mastermind who manipulated 2 younger men into murder? Or was she the manipulated victim, an intellectually disabled woman exploited by a smarter, more dangerous predator? Everything hung on that answer. The prosecution painted Teresa Lewis as a monster in human skin. They argued she was the architect of the entire murder plot. She seduced Matthew Shallenberger specifically to find someone willing to kill for her. She obtained the weapons. She left the door unlocked. She stood by while her husband and stepson were executed. And most damningly, she waited 45 minutes while they bled to death, ensuring no one would survive to expose her. The prosecutors presented her as calculating, manipulative, and driven purely by greed. That $300,000 insurance payout wasn't just a motive, it was her endgame. In their narrative, Matthew and Rodney were merely her tools, young men she'd used and discarded. She pulled no trigger, the prosecution acknowledged. But make no mistake, she murdered these men as surely as if she'd held a gun herself. The defense told a completely different story. They presented medical evidence of Teresa's IQ 72, borderline intellectual disability. They brought in psychologists who testified that Teresa lacked the cognitive ability to mastermind such a complex crime. They argued that Matthew Shallenberger, smarter, more manipulative, criminally minded, was the real architect. He'd identified Teresa's vulnerabilities, her desperate need for love, her limited intellect, and her emotional dependency. He'd weaponized those weaknesses, turning her into an accomplice while keeping his own hands relatively clean. Teresa wasn't the predator, the defense insisted. She was the prey. But juries don't always see nuance. They see dead bodies, grieving families, insurance policies, unlocked doors. October 12, 2003, the jury returned with their recommendation. Death. Teresa Lewis would be executed by lethal injection. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation and made it official. She became the first woman sentenced to death in Virginia in over 90 years. But here's where this case becomes deeply, troublingly controversial. Matthew Shallenberger, the man who actually shot Julian Lewis in the head while he slept, accepted a plea deal. His sentence? Life in prison without parole. No death penalty. Rodney Fuller, the man who shot C.J. Lewis multiple times, also took a plea deal. His sentence? Life in prison with the possibility of parole. Let that sink in for a moment. The two men who physically pulled the triggers, who actually committed the murders, would live. Teresa Lewis, who never fired a shot, would die. Do you think the person who plans a murder is worse than the person who pulls the trigger? It's a question that divided legal experts, ethicists, and the public. Some argued that the mastermind deserves the harshest punishment, that planning a murder in cold calculation is worse than being the weapon. Others saw it as a fundamental injustice. How could the state execute someone with an IQ of 72 while sparing the actual killers? I want to hear from you right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Was this justice or was this wrong? Hit that like button and subscribe because the story is far from over, and what happens next will shock you even more. Teresa Lewis spent 8 years on death row at Fluvanna Correctional Center for women in Troy, Virginia. 8 years waiting to die. Something unexpected happened during those years. Teresa became a model prisoner. She attended religious services regularly. She helped other inmates. She mentored younger women, offering guidance and support. Guards describe her as cooperative, kind, and remorseful. She maintained close relationships with her daughter Christy and her grandchildren. They visited when they could, sitting across from each other in sterile visiting rooms, separated by glass and circumstance. Christy never abandoned her mother, even as the execution date loomed closer. Teresa wrote letters expressing deep remorse for what she'd done. She didn't deny her guilt. She didn't make excuses. She simply said she wished she could take it all back, that she'd give anything to undo that terrible night. But death row doesn't care about reformation. It doesn't care about regret. The sentence had been passed, and the clock was ticking. As her case gained national attention, something remarkable happened. The world started paying attention to Teresa Lewis, not just as a murderer, but as a human being caught in a deeply flawed system. The outcry began small, then grew into a roar. The European Union issued a formal statement urging Virginia to spare Teresa's life, citing concerns about executing someone with intellectual disabilities. Amnesty International launched a campaign highlighting the injustice of her sentence compared to Matthew and Rodney's. Then former President Jimmy Carter himself wrote a letter to Virginia's governor, pleading for clemency. Carter argued that executing Teresa while the actual triggermen lived was fundamentally unjust. The IQ debate became central to the appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in 2002 that executing people with intellectual disabilities violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But there was a threshold, generally an IQ below 70. Teresa's IQ was 72. 2 points. 2 points separated her from constitutional protection. 2 points that would determine whether she lived or died. Her lawyers argued those 2 points shouldn't matter, that she clearly lacked the mental capacity to mastermind a complex murder plot. Opponents argued the law was clear, and Teresa fell just outside the protected range. The legal battles raged. Appeals were filed and denied. The execution date was set, postponed, and set again. And then in 2010, something happened that seemed to validate everything the defense had been saying all along. Matthew Shallenberger, serving his life sentence in prison, committed suicide. Before Matthew died, he wrote letters that suggested he had been the true mastermind all along, that he'd manipulated Teresa, exploited her desperation and limited intellect, and used her as a pawn in his own deadly game. The very thing the defense had argued for years. Matthew finally admitted it, but the confession came too late. Teresa's execution date was already set. The legal appeals were exhausted. Matthew's suicide and deathbed admissions couldn't stop what was already in motion. September 23rd, 2010. Teresa Lewis had 1 day left to live, and the world was watching. September 23rd, 2010. Teresa Lewis woke up knowing she would not see September 24th. Her last day on Earth had arrived. That morning, Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell made his final decision on her clemency petition. Thousands had signed petitions. International leaders had pleaded. Former presidents had intervened. The governor denied clemency. In his statement, McDonnell acknowledged that Teresa hadn't pulled the trigger, but he maintained she was the mastermind of the murder and deserved the punishment the jury had recommended 8 years earlier. The execution would proceed as scheduled. 9 p.m. Teresa was transferred from Fluvanna to Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia, the facility that housed Virginia's death chamber. She was placed in a cell directly adjacent to the room where she would die. 13 feet separated her from the gurney. The cell was small, cold, and institutional. Gray concrete walls, a narrow bed, a toilet, fluorescent lights that hummed constantly overhead. She could hear the preparation happening on the other side of the wall. The execution team testing equipment, checking 4 lines, and rehearsing the protocol they would use to end her life. Every sound must have been torture. Every footstep a reminder. Every voice a countdown. Outside the prison, protesters gathered. Some held signs demanding justice for Julian and C.J. Lewis. Others held candles, praying for mercy, arguing that the state was about to commit its own murder. Inside, Teresa waited. Teresa was allowed visitors during her final hours. Her spiritual advisor came first, offering prayers and comfort. They spoke quietly, reading scripture, seeking peace in a place designed for death. Her attorney arrived next, reviewing final legal options that they both knew wouldn't work. Every appeal had been exhausted. Every court had ruled. There was nothing left but goodbye. Then Christy came, Teresa's daughter, the one person she pleaded guilty to protect 8 years earlier. The visit was emotional in ways words cannot fully capture. A mother and daughter separated by glass and bars, knowing these were their final moments together. What do you say when you know you'll never see each other again? How do you fit a lifetime of love and regret into a few stolen hours? They cried. They talked. They held their hands up to the glass, palm to palm, as close to an embrace as the system would allow. Christy told her mother she loved her. Teresa told Christy she was sorry for everything, for the pain, for the choices that led to this moment. When the visit ended, Christy walked away knowing her mother would be dead in hours. Around 6 p.m., Teresa's last meal arrived. She requested fried chicken, peas with butter, a slice of German chocolate cake, and a Dr. Pepper. Simple comfort food. The kind of meal that reminded her of better days, simpler times, and life before everything fell apart. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring tastes she would never experience again. After the meal, Teresa spent her remaining hours in prayer. She read her Bible. She wrote final letters. She spoke with her spiritual advisor about forgiveness, redemption, and what might come after death. The clock moved mercilessly forward. 7 p.m., 2 hours left. 8 p.m., 1 hour left. 8:30 p.m., 30 minutes. At 8:45 p.m., the execution team entered her cell. They were professional, clinical, and efficient. They explained the procedure one final time. Though Teresa had heard it before, they asked if she understood. She nodded. They escorted her from the cell to the death chamber, a walk of maybe 20 steps that must have felt like miles. The chamber was sterile and cold. In the center sat the gurney, padded but unforgiving, with leather restraints attached. Witnesses sat behind glass. Families of the victims, media representatives, and prison officials, all there to watch a human being die. Teresa was strapped down, arms extended. IV lines were inserted into both arms. 2 lines for redundancy, in case one failed. She lay there, restrained, waiting for the drugs that would stop her heart. A microphone was positioned near her head. The warden asked if she had any final words. Teresa's voice was soft, trembling, and filled with emotion she could barely contain. "I just want Kathy to know that I love her, and I'm very sorry." A pause. Then, "I just wish I could have just taken it all back." Those were her last words. At 9 p.m., the warden gave the signal. The first drug entered Teresa's bloodstream, sodium thiopental, a sedative meant to render her unconscious. Her eyes grew heavy. Her breathing slowed. The second drug followed, pancuronium bromide, a paralytic that stopped her lungs from functioning. The third and final drug, potassium chloride, stopped her heart. Teresa Lewis took her last breath. Her body went still. At 9:13 p.m. on September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead. She was 41 years old. She became the first woman executed in Virginia in 98 years. Only the 12th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Outside, the protesters dispersed. Inside, the witnesses filed out in silence. 2 men had been murdered 8 years earlier. Now 3 people were dead, and the questions remained. Was this justice, or was this just more tragedy piled upon tragedy? The execution of Teresa Lewis didn't end the debate. If anything, it intensified it. To this day, her case remains one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern American history. Legal scholars, human rights advocates, and everyday people continue to argue about whether justice was truly served that night in September 2010. The IQ question haunts the case. Teresa scored 72, just 2 points above the threshold that would have made her execution unconstitutional. 2 points. The difference between life and death is measured by a number on a test. Critics argue that the Supreme Court's ruling against executing people with intellectual disabilities shouldn't hinge on an arbitrary cutoff. If the purpose is to protect people who lack the mental capacity to fully understand their actions, then Teresa clearly qualified. She was manipulated, exploited, and used as a tool by someone smarter and more cunning. But the law is a law, supporters argued. Lines must be drawn somewhere. Teresa fell on the wrong side of that line. Then there's the other question, the one that refuses to go away. Should the person who plans a murder die while the people who actually committed get to live? Matthew Shallenberger and Rodney Fuller, the men who physically shot Julian and C.J. Lewis, who pulled the triggers and who watched 2 innocent men die. Both received life sentences. No execution. No death penalty. Some people see this as fundamentally unjust. How can you execute the planner, but spare the executioners? Isn't the person who fires the bullets more culpable than the person who orchestrates from a distance? Others argue the opposite. The mastermind is always more guilty than the weapon. Teresa conceived the plot. She facilitated the murders. She waited 45 minutes to ensure both men died. That level of cold calculation, they say, deserves the ultimate punishment. For the families of Julian and C.J. Lewis, the execution brought a measure of closure. They'd waited 8 years to see Teresa pay for orchestrating the murders of their loved ones. They believed justice had been served, even if it couldn't bring Julian and C.J. back. But Christy, Teresa's daughter, has spoken publicly about her mother's case over the years. She's never denied her mother's guilt. Teresa was guilty. Christy knows that. But she believes the death penalty was too harsh given her mother's intellectual limitations and the manipulation she endured. At the end of it all, 3 lives were destroyed by one night of violence. Julian Lewis, 51, a hard-working man who trusted his wife, murdered in his own bed. C.J. Lewis, 25, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, was shot down trying to save his father. And Teresa Lewis, 41, executed by the state for a crime born from desperation, manipulation, and greed. This case teaches us something profound about human vulnerability, about how desperation can make people cross lines they never imagined crossing, about how manipulation exploits our weakest moments, about how a need for love and validation can be weaponized into something deadly. It also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our justice system. Do we apply the death penalty fairly? Do we adequately account for intellectual disability and emotional manipulation? Is execution ever truly just, or is it simply more violence added to violence? I don't have all the answers. Maybe you do. Before you go, I need you to do something. If this story affected you, if it made you think, made you feel something, made you question what justice really means, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment right now and tell me, do you think Teresa Lewis deserved to die? Or was her execution a tragic mistake? Should Matthew and Rodney have faced the death penalty instead? Your voice matters. These conversations matter. Because real stories deserve real engagement. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.